Okay, so San Francisco Board of Supervisors meeting minutes. Not exactly, beach reading.
Right.
But
Yeah.
trust me on this one. These minutes are like, they're like a secret decoder ring to understand how the city actually works. We're talking behind the scenes battles, surprise alliances, decisions that affect, your daily life, whether you realize it or not.
That's right. Think of it this way. Every street closure, every park renovation, every new housing development, it all starts with a vote in these meetings.
Yes.
And by diving into the minutes, we get this, fly-on-the-wall perspective that most people never see.
And for this deep dive, we're looking at two specific meetings from earlier this year, April 2nd and June 11th, 2024. And let me tell you, there is no shortage of drama, from heated debates over neighborhood permits to some seriously intense mayoral appointment showdowns. April 2nd in particular was a wild ride, full house, all 11 supervisors present. They had a massive agenda to tackle.
It's interesting that you mentioned the full attendance, because if we look at what was happening in San Francisco at the time, a spike in property crime, the whole downtown post-pandemic recovery, a looming budget deficit, these were not small potatoes. So you can bet the supervisors were feeling the pressure to deliver that day.
Absolutely, and they dove right in. We're talking about everything from new rules about selling tobacco, which, by the way, was a surprisingly contentious issue, to multi-million-dollar lawsuit settlements. It's like a crash course in city governance, but with way more intrigue.
Oh, and then there's the case of 2351 Mission Street, which was basically a real-life San Francisco showdown.
Right. And that's a perfect example of how these minutes can be so revealing.
Yeah.
Because they don't just tell you what happened, they tell you who said what, how each supervisor voted, and sometimes you even get a little bit of the emotion behind it all. So picture this. Sunny afternoon in April, the Board of Supervisors chambers are packed, Clerk Angela Calvillo calls the meeting to order, and boom, we are off to the races. Now, I know we could spend hours unpacking every single item on this agenda, but for the sake of your time and our sanity, we've curated a selection of the most interesting, the most impactful, and let's be honest, the most entertaining items for your listening pleasure.
Sounds good. So where do we begin?
Well, let's start with a few ordinances and resolutions. That had a direct impact on residents, like Ordinance 231-225, this one, put forward by Supervisors Preston and Peskin, was all about restricting new businesses selling tobacco paraphernalia, specifically in the north of Market and Lower Polk Street areas.
Did that even come up as a major issue? Those areas aren't exactly overrun with smoke shops.
Right. And you're not wrong. There wasn't much vocal opposition to this ordinance. The key here is that it was likely more about getting ahead of the game. Remember, this is San Francisco, a city constantly trying to reinvent itself. So by restricting these kinds of businesses and up-and-coming commercial districts, they're trying to shape not just how these neighborhoods look, but also their vibe, their identity.
It's kind of like city planning as brand management. They're saying, this is the image we want to project. And we're using zoning laws to make it happen.
Exactly. And it speaks to this larger trend we're seeing across California to tighten regulations on tobacco products, particularly in areas known for nightlife, or those trying to attract families.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've got city planning as brand management. What else did our supervisors have on their plates that day?
Well, before we dive into the main event, and trust me, this one is a doozy, we should touch on these lawsuit settlements. Because, wow, the city can shell out some serious cash.
Right, I was looking through these figures. $2.8 million for one employment dispute. What's the story there?
Yes, the case of Danielle Dillard and Kim Lee. Now, the specifics are kept under wraps, but that kind of payout tells you it wasn't a simple open and shut case. And this is where those meeting minutes, for all their dryness, give us a peek behind the curtain, settling these lawsuits. Especially when it comes to employment law, is often a strategic move. It's about mitigating risk. They're basically saying, let's cut our losses now before this drags on and potentially costs us even more in court fees and bad publicity.
It's like that old saying, a penny of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Except in this case, it's more like $1 million settlement is worth potentially tens of millions in legal battles.
Exactly. Now, are you ready for that main event I mentioned?
Hit me with it. What was the issue that had everyone on the edge of their seats?
Well, it all went down at 2351 Mission Street. Picture this. A seemingly straightforward request to add an outdoor activity area to an existing restaurant. Sounds innocent enough, right?
Sure. Who doesn't love a good patio? Especially post-pandemic.
Yeah.
Those outdoor spaces are like gold.
Right. But here's the rub. This particular stretch of Mission Street has specific zoning regulations. They're very strict about things like noise levels, hours of operation, especially when it comes to impacting the surrounding residential areas. And let's just say, the residents were not shy about voicing their concerns about this proposed outdoor space.
You know, it's amazing how these seemingly minor zoning issues can ignite such passionate debates. It really speaks to how deeply people care about their neighborhoods and their quality of life.
Absolutely. And in San Francisco, those debates often center around this tension between preserving the character of our neighborhoods while also allowing for growth and change. And in the case of 2351 Mission Street, that tension was on full display.
Okay, so set the scene for us. We've got residents fired up about noise, parking, the whole 9 yards. What happens when this conditional use authorization actually lands in the laps of our supervisors?
Well, let me tell you, this is where those meeting minutes become more than just dry records. They become a front row seat to San Francisco politics in action. Because after that public comment period, where residents really let their feelings be known, the supervisors had a series of motions to consider. And this is where you start to see the wheels turning, the alliances forming, and the compromises, or lack thereof, taking shape.
It sounds like we're about to witness some serious legislative maneuvering.
Oh, absolutely. First up, there was a motion to simply approve the Planning Commission's original decision, which, if you recall, was to grant that conditional use authorization for the outdoor space. But that motion didn't even make it to a vote.
Really? What happened?
Supervisor Ronan, seconded by Supervisor Mandelman, moved to table the motion. Now, for those who don't speak fluent City Hall, tabling a motion basically means putting it on hold indefinitely. And here's the kicker. That motion to table passed unanimously. All 11 supervisors agreed to pump the brakes.
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty clear signal that they weren't ready to just rubber stamp the Planning Commission's decision. They recognized that this was a hot-button issue.
Right, and it suggests they were hearing those concerns from residents loud and clear. But then it gets even more interesting, because the next motion on the table was to completely deny the conditional use authorization, so no patio. End of story. You would think that with all the resident pushback, this one would sail through, right?
Yeah, you'd think so.
Yeah.
Especially since tabling the first motion showed they were at least somewhat sympathetic to the residents' concerns.
Exactly. But here's where Supervisor Ronan throws a curveball. Instead of voting on that second motion, she proposes an amendment. And this amendment, my friend, is where the art of the deal comes into play.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What did this compromise look like?
Well, it wasn't about the size of the patio. That stayed the same. It was about the hours. Instead of being open until 10 p.m., the amendment allowed for the outdoor area to stay open until 11 p.m. Sunday through Thursday, and until midnight on Friday and Saturday. So a little win for the restaurant, letting them capitalize on those busy weekend nights.
Right, because those extra few hours of service can translate to a lot of revenue, especially in a city that loves its late-night dining.
Exactly. But here's the key part. Those extended hours came with a major caveat. The amendment also required the restaurant to implement a 3-step sound mitigation plan. We're talking higher walls, sound dampening materials, and adjustments to the sound system to minimize noise bleeding into the neighborhood. It was basically saying, you can have your cake, but you'd better eat it quietly.
That's such a classic San Francisco solution, right?
Yeah.
It's like, we love our restaurants, we love our nightlife, but we also cherish our peace and quiet.
You nailed it. And here's the thing. That amendment, with the extended hours and the mandatory soundproofing, also passed unanimously. Even supervisors who might have been initially inclined to side with the business owners saw the wisdom in finding a compromise.
It makes you wonder, was this a genuine desire to find a middle ground? Or was it also a strategic move? You know?
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be seen as ignoring neighborhood concerns, especially in an election year.
It's a great question, and one that we can only speculate about, but I think it highlights the complexities of governing a city like San Francisco, where you have to constantly balance competing interests and find creative solutions.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating glimpse into the delicate dance of power, public opinion, and good old-fashioned compromise. That goes on behind the scenes.
It's like they always say, in San Francisco, you're never more than a block away from a good cup of coffee, a stunning view, and a heated debate about development.
So true. And that 2351 Mission Street case, it really epitomizes those micro-level dramas that play out in this city every day.
Yeah.
Speaking of dramas, we can't forget about those mayoral appointments. On June 11th's agenda, those always have the potential to shake things up.
You are absolutely right. Especially when it comes to the police commission, these appointments are watched very closely. And this meeting had not one, but two openings on the commission to fill. Talk about high stakes.
Exactly.
And remember how that April 2nd meeting started with a full house? June 11th was almost the opposite. Supervisor Safai was marked absent for the initial roll call.
And that's not just a procedural footnote. The board needs at least 6 supervisors present to actually vote on anything. That's called a quorum. So with only 10 supervisors there at the start, they were one unexpected absence away from grinding to a halt.
It's like they were walking a tightrope that day. Every vote mattered even more.
Absolutely. And did you know that missing a meeting without being excused can actually get a supervisor censured by the board? It's happened in the past.
Wow, talk about accountability. But luckily for everyone, Supervisor Safai did arrive later, right?
He did, about an hour and a half into the meeting. Crisis averted. But not before they tackled a whole marathon session of MOU approvals, which, by the way, stands for Memorandum of Understanding. Basically, these are the contracts negotiated between the city and its various unions.
And those MOUs can be a big deal, right? We're talking about wages,
Yeah.
benefits, working conditions for thousands of city employees, not to mention a huge chunk of the city's budget.
You got it. And with San Francisco staring down that budget deficit, you can bet those MOU discussions were extra tense. Now, the minutes themselves, they don't dive into the nitty-gritty of those debates, but the vote counts speak volumes.
What do you mean?
Well, most of the MOUs sailed through with a 10-0 vote. Keep in mind, Supervisor Safai was still MIA for that part of the meeting, but that kind of unanimous agreement suggests that, for the most part. The supervisors were on board with how those contracts were negotiated, except for one.
Oh, which one was that?
The MOU with the San Francisco Police Officers Association,
Oh.
or SFPOA as it's usually called.
Yeah.
Now, if you've been paying any attention to San Francisco politics, you know the SFPOA is always a lightning rod issue.
And this vote definitely reflects that. Instead of a 10-0, the SFPOA contract passed with a 7-3 vote. Supervisors Preston, Ronan, and Walton all voted against it.
Which is interesting, because those three are generally seen as being more progressive, more in favor of things like police reform and increased social spending. So their no votes likely reflect deeper concerns about police accountability, or maybe even pushback against the financial terms of the contract, especially given that looming budget deficit we talked about.
It's like their own little microcosm of the citywide debate about police funding and oversight.
Exactly. And speaking of those broader citywide debates, let's talk about the police commission appointments. This is where those June 11th minutes really get juicy. We've got 2 open seats, 2 very different candidates, and a whole lot of political maneuvering.
You're talking about Deborah Walker's reappointment, right?
Yep. Now, just a quick reminder for our listeners, the police commission is like the civilian watchdog. For the San Francisco Police Department, they set policies, investigate complaints against officers. They're the ones holding the police accountable to the public. So who sits on that commission? Huge deal.
Absolutely. And Deborah Walker. She was already on the commission, right? Appointed by Mayor Breed back in 2020.
Right. So this was a vote on whether to give her another 4-year term. But from the looks of these minutes, it was not a guaranteed win. In fact, it seemed like the motion to reject her reappointment might actually pass. Supervisors Preston, Ronan, and Walton, remember those names from the SFPOA vote? They were leading the charge against her.
They argued that Walker hadn't pushed hard enough for police reform. During her first term,
That was a big part of it. They felt she wasn't the right fit to lead the commission through what they saw as a crucial moment for police accountability. And for a while there, it seemed like they had the votes to block her reappointment.
but then plot twist. Supervisor Dorsey, who's often considered more moderate on police issues, stepped in with the surprise amendment. He proposed that they actually approve her reappointment.
Talk about a shakeup. What was his reasoning there?
Well, he acknowledged that he shared some of the concerns about the pace of police reform, but he also argued that Walker was, in his words, a qualified and experienced commissioner who deserved another term. And his amendment, you guessed it, passed with a 7-3 vote. Those 3 no votes, yep, you guessed again, Preston, Ronan, and Walton.
So the same supervisors who voted against the SFPOA contract also voted against Walker, even though they were on opposite sides of the actual outcome.
It's almost like they're saying, we hear you, we see the need for change, but we're not convinced that this particular person is the one to lead that change.
Exactly. It really highlights those deeper divisions within the board and within San Francisco as a whole about what police reform should look like and who should be leading the charge.
And that right there is why we love digging into these meeting minutes. They might not always be pretty, But they never fail to reveal those undercurrents of power, those shifting alliances, and those passionate debates
Yeah.
that are shaping the future of San Francisco.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that local government, it's not just about abstract policies, it's about real people
Mm.
with real stakes in the game. And those decisions, made in those meetings, they have a ripple effect. That touches every corner of our lives.
So the next time you find yourself with a little bit of time on your hands and maybe a strong cup of coffee, take a peek at those Board of Supervisors meeting minutes. You might just be surprised by what you discover.